Like Alexis said, my name is Lily Houtman. I'm a PhD candidate at Penn State, and today I am presenting a project that I'm doing in collaboration with Dr. Melissa Wright, who is a professor in my department. Primarily, she is a human geographer, and a lot of her work has been in the Mexico-US border region / the Rio Grande, and so we are kind of coming together for this project on designing non-binary maps. And so I saw Melissa give a talk and saw the maps that she used in her talk, and my advisor kind of turned to me and said, you know, not that her maps are bad, but I bet we could make some better ones for her and ones that, you know, really fit her purpose. And so that's how we kind of got started on this project, because Melissa has a lot of particular ideas about how she wants to portray experiences in that region as truly like a borderlands, where the experiences of people, you know, on both sides of this state, you know, nation-state border are more similar to each other than they are different. And so we want to see this as a borderland region and not as this binary division. And so we're bringing in a lot of queer and trans theory, especially Munoz and the Brown Commons, which I will kind of get to later in this presentation, and showing like the power of coalitions and how different minorities, you know, kind of come together to have shared similar experiences of oppression. And we're kind of trying to represent that in maps, which is a big ask, but it's been a fun project to work on. So this is not a map that I made. This is one of the maps that Melissa was using in her presentations before I joined the project, and it's not bad by any means. I really like that there's, you know, kind of this halo almost around the border, and so it shows that complexity of the region. But you know, it's a very simple map, first of all, and we can see that the US states are labeled individually, but Mexico is just labeled as one giant country. So we thought, you know, there's ways that we can improve this. And she does also show this in some of her previous presentations. It's kind of more of this geologic, hydrologic map. And so this map actually doesn't show borders, which is awesome. You know, if you're a geologist, it doesn't just stop when there's a nation-state border. And so that's really awesome, but you know, it's not super colorful. It might not be super accessible to a general audience, and so we wanted to make a few maps that might be a little bit more accessible. And so when we're thinking about borders and how the Rio Grande specifically has, as a river, has been used to define a lot of the US-Mexico border, the funny thing is, the river itself is constantly changing. Like, rivers inherently carve the landscape. They don't stay in one place. They wiggle around a little bit, you know, year after year. And so to use that to define a border is actually a little silly, because they don't stay in one place. They don't care that people are trying to use this and governments are trying to use this to define a border, because they're just moving as they've done for thousands, millions of years. And, you know, animals and plants in nature, they are also existing without borders in the way that we see them. You know, there might be animal species that, you know, they kind of have an edge of the habitat, but that edge is really fuzzy, right? It's not, you know, this harsh border is here. It's fuzzy and it's fluid. And even lots of people, you know, lived in similar ways before we had, you know, these colonial maps that are imposing these harsh edges of modern borders. People, you know, they might have had some semblance of this is my land, this is your land, but, you know, the edges were a little bit more fluid than they are today and represent, you know, cultures coming together. And so this led to us kind of creating just this first map, pretty simple. Sorry that the color is coming through a little bit weird in this room. But we're taking away primarily the nation-state border here. We still have state borders in this, just to help for some context. You know, if she was presenting to an undergrad class or to a conference of people not really familiar with the region, this would help people contextualize, although here we label the Mexican states as well, in addition to the US states. But we wanted to think beyond that too. You know, we can have multiple maps in this series, and so we're kind of thinking, you know, how can we show maximalism? Because a lot of of the Western mapping tradition is kind of towards minimalism, as little information as possible, so that way you can read the map really fast and move on to the next thing. But, our lived experience and reality is just so complex, and so can we try to represent that on a map? And so maybe in some of these maps you can't actually read every single thing on the map. Maybe you can't, you don't have time, or it's just like too complex, but isn't that how the real world is anyway? If you're going for a walk, you're not gonna comprehend every single thing that you see. And so that led to this version of the map. We've added in some terrain, and we've added on rivers, roads, and railroads. And so a major point of this map is to show this fluidity and this connectivity across this entire region. And something that when Melissa is presenting to scholars of this region, or to anyone, kind of asking, where would you draw the border? If you were given this map and shown this connectivity and fluidity, where would you draw a border? And if you had to choose, I bet everyone would have a little bit of a different answer, because there's not just one clear place that makes sense for there to be a border because of all this connectivity. The railroads and the roads were transversing across this region, for hundreds of years before, obviously these borders existed, but the harshness of them has been a more recent phenomenon. And so to add to the complexity just a little bit more, we also created a version that shows some of the major cities in the region, to just, add more and more complexity to this map. And so we've got a little bit of city population in there as well. And so there's a few other aspects that we wanted to show in some different maps. And so, related to borders being used to define this region and this human attempt at controlling the region, dams are also something that, people are trying to control these rivers. And so they're trying to use them as borders. They're trying to use dams to control the rivers as well. And so we created a really quick and simple map that just shows some of the major dams within this river basin. And then additionally, we wanted to think about nature specifically and how non-human life might be impacted by these human politics, these human-imposed borders. And so we created a version that does actually show the border, and it shows this region a little bit more extensively. And you can see the protected natural areas in green in both Mexico and the US, varying levels of protection depending on who is in control of that land. But you can see that some of these stop right at the border. And so if there's animals who historically their habitat would have been in that area transversing across the region, today they might actually be stopped. And even birds and butterflies are affected by this. I would have thought at the beginning that maybe they can fly over the border wall, for example, because they can fly. But it turns out that a lot of them are psychologically stopped by seeing that border there, even though in theory they have the ability to fly over it, which is really interesting to me. And so we don't want to remove the border from every single map, because sometimes it provides this essential context of how it actually impacts the life of people and animals and everything else. So then we wanted to keep thinking kind of more in a theory side of things, what else can we add to these maps? And we were both really inspired by Munoz and the Brown Commons, which is this idea of, it's a very complex idea. It's kind of the coming together of everyday, people, places, feelings related to this idea of brown. And so a lot of it is based on the lived experience of brown people, but it's so much more complex than that, trying to bring in different animals and things like that, and how, the existence of being brown causes kind of this suffering, but also pulling through. And so it is kind of a color of shared by a commons that is of and for the multitude. And so it's thinking about fluidity and complexity of experience. And so, of course, this border space, we have to, recognize and understand that brown people are more likely to experience, the policing of this region. There's, so many issues with ICE right now, of course. And so, the Brown Commons and Munoz's idea of it is very much centered in brown bodies, but it is so much more than that. And so it encourages us to resist binaries and hierarchies, not just in race, but also in other groups as well, like gender, because we can think about, what are the coalitionary possibilities? What ways can we bring together different minority groups and different struggles to see, this shared common oppressor? And so, for example, if we're thinking about borders, people of color are often more likely to be policed at these borders or living in spaces near these borders. And at the same time, these governments who want to police people for their race are also policing gender. We see in the US right now, it's very difficult to be trans and trying to get a passport. X gender markers are just not happening. And even for binary trans people, you're often forced to get a passport with your birth sex. And so that is coming from the same oppression and attempt at control as is this racialized oppression. And it's just a general theme of control by these governments. And so the way that this inspired us to think is re-envisioning the maps to actually be brown. And so in addition to this kind of, grand theory aspect of it, there's also a literal brownness to a lot of bodies of water. So oceans, some big lakes, those we kind of see as blue in real life, but a lot of rivers are flowing through silt and soil and things like that, and so they're actually brown if you see them in the landscape, but on maps we represent them as blue. And I think the general public consensus is that brown is not as beautiful of a color on maps compared to blue. There is kind of some interesting connections to blue and racial hierarchy in terms of blue eyes and Nazi ideology and things like that. So what we're trying to push here is bringing these ideas all together, and then also trying to promote brown as something that can be a beautiful color. Many people have a dog or a cat that might be brown. And they, find that creature to be beautiful, so why can't we use brown in maps as well? And so this is kind of a re-envisioning of the map that I had on the previous slide, but just completely in brown. And so it is a little bit more confusing because the colors are more similar. So, when it comes to thinking about distinguishing between different features on the map, they are a little bit more similar. But again, as I was discussing before, there's this complexity to, not being able to distinguish the different features, and just kind of seeing it as a picture of the region as a whole. And so we made a series of 4 maps. This next one, we took off those state borders as well. Again, we're including the state borders on some to help people contextualize the region, but we can also see them without borders. In this one, we've taken off the legend and the population data, and so without the legend at all, you don't really know what the different colors refer to. You just kind of see this complex picture of the river basin. And then in the 4th and final one, we add back in the major US-Mexico border, and we display it as such a thick line to emphasize its impact on the region. Again, people's lived experiences in these regions are affected by the border. However, we include it here as a dotted line to help think about how it doesn't have to be permanent. It doesn't have to be this harsh thing that is defining our lives. That's just what it is right now. So it's to envision, different futures. And so as we continue to play with this work, we're kind of thinking about what is a line on a map, because we've seen it as a line of connection. Roads often lead to connection. They can, bring you to a new place, or are they something for division, such as the border line, or maybe it's both or either, such as a river, for example. Some creatures might be able to move across the river while others can't. And so it's kind of interesting that there's all these lines on these maps, such a basic thing that we all put on all of our maps. And there's just a multitude of possibilities of what they are, whether they're connection or division or something in between. So that's been kind of fun to think about. And so we're kind of still in progress of this, and so any comments and feedback that you all have, I would love to hear. We're especially trying to think how to visualize border space without a border, and so this is something I'm kind of playing with using gradients, where, you know, that border might be kind of a fluidy, gradienty line in the middle, and we are going to be working on some academic publications on this as well, if you love what we're doing and want to read more about it, hopefully soon. So thank you very much. I have this version of the map in the map gallery if you would like to see it a little bit bigger and printed more nicely than on this screen. And if we have time for questions, I can do that. If not, maybe after our last presenter. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for that talk. I just have a question. It reminds me, or makes me think rather, of the work by Tiffany Letherbo King on the shoals, in which she discusses the way in which certain spaces are unmappable precisely because they deny or fidget under the lines of the map. And one of the points that she makes is that in de Brahm's map of the Carolinas, the only black people who are represented, or the only people who are represented on the map are the black slaves in the cartouche, whereas throughout the entire map, you see these lines of whiteness and whiteness washing through the map itself. And I'm kind of interested the way in which, like, yeah, I think colour does play a really important role, but the map itself, as a kind of convention, as a way of bounding and lining and necessarily trying to make visible, I think is also, or could be understood as an act of whiteness. And I'm wondering how in your process you're kind of grappling with this sort of central idea as map makers representing people who perhaps are trying to not be represented or seen at all because being seen is a space of danger.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. And so I would say that one thing that we're thinking about is that a lot of research that Melissa has done in this area is very much text-based. It's not visual, it's not map-based, and maps can kind of be this communication piece that can help people understand something so much easier, maybe not easier, but in a different way than written text. And so we kind of are trying to have an accessibility component of like meeting people in this different way and thinking about things visually in a different way. And then I think like the other answer to that question is like, at least at this point in the process, we haven't really mapped any one person's individual experience. We're not, you know, using data of specific people. It's these very general, broad data sets about rivers and roads. And so I would personally feel a lot more discomfort, you know, trying to say, like, let's tell one person's story, because that does bring a visibility to one person or a smaller group of people. But by trying to map things more broadly, hopefully we're not putting a target on the back of any one particular person. But I don't have like a perfect answer for that, and that's like something we're working on and thinking about, and so I'd love to talk about it more later if you would like.
Excellent, thank you. Our next speaker, oh yes, sorry, applause.